Hello all and welcome to this webinar on how to beat the blame culture. Today we're going to be focusing on strategies to create a culture of accountability and personal responsibility for safety, even during challenging economic times. I'll be your presenter for today. My name's Anthony Gibbs and I'm the CEO of Centus. I've been working in the safety culture field for going on 13 years now, and I've got a strong passion for building cultures of accountability to help everyone get home safe to the people, things, and places that matter most to them. Centus, for those of you who are not aware, is an organisation with a mission focused on changing the lives of individuals and organisations for the better every day. We apply psychology and neuroscience to enhance leadership capabilities and to create organisational engagement and alignment towards best practice in regards to safety. So we're actually born originally out of a challenge within industry of helping people take greater accountability for their safety choices. So this topic is a topic very close to our core business and a topic very close to my heart, because I know just how powerful some of these tools and resources can be. So thank you again for joining us. Today we're using GoToWebinar. You can see on the screen the control panel, just a little bit of housekeeping here. If you want to collapse or expand that control panel, click the orange arrow. Everyone will be participated throughout this webinar. However, if you want to send comments or questions, feel free to type them into the chat box and hit send. Gemma will be curating those for us as we go through. So your opportunity to ask questions and get those responded to will be throughout. There's also an opportunity to download a resource you can see on the screen there. It's a really useful resource focused on helping guide us through this particular challenge together. So if you want to take some notes or you want to have that as a reference point for later on, please feel free to download that. This webinar will also be recorded and provided to you post the session. So after the session, you'll be sent an email with a recording of the webinar, a copy of the slides, and all the associated resources as well. So if you miss anything throughout the webinar or you want to know more, you have plenty of opportunity to review those notes at a later date. So we've got quite a meaty topic to get through together today, and we're going to do it in 4 steps. We'll be starting by focusing on how to identify a blame culture. What does it look like to work within a blame culture? I'm sure many of you on the line will have a pretty clear sense of that, but teasing that out in a bit more detail. We'll be looking at the role of leaders and how they contribute to creating a blame culture or a culture of ownership. And then we'll be looking at some specific tools to build a culture of accountability and ownership, and we'll have a bit of a chat about what good looks like in this space as well. So that'll be the 4 key steps we'll be working through. So we'll start with number 1 there, identifying a blame culture. So I'll start by actually asking the question to the group, and if you're open to it, please type in the chat, what are some of the symptoms or signs that you see in a blame culture? So if you've been within an organization, what are some of the symptoms that suggest that there is a blame culture existing within that particular business? As you're having a bit of a think about that, and if you type in a few notes, we'll share a couple of the typical signs and symptoms that we see at Centus. So typically we see low personal accountability, low cultural maturity. We see an end output of generally poorer safety performance. Underreporting is often very high within these organizations. There'll be a sense of compliance only when monitored. Incident investigations tend to seek to attribute blame to an individual more often than not, and we saw that there's a low or poor organizational learning culture and a general fear-based approach to enforcing safety. So there's some of the signs that we typically see. We often see organizations, particularly when they're in a state of stress or duress, much like many organizations are experiencing right now, they'll fall into somewhere in this blame continuum. Generally, we see that taking ownership of our choices is easier, or ownership of outcomes is easier when things go to plan. But it's when things don't go to plan, when things go wrong, or when incidents occur that organizational cultures and a blame culture really gets tested out. So we've got a bit of a continuum here from blame to accountability. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are cultures that some of you are probably very familiar with. where there's this systemic blame culture. It's long-standing, it's the way we do things around here. We'll often see the next stage will be fair weather friends. So in these types of cultures, it's when the pressure really starts to be applied that the fingers get pointed at other people. So there's often a thin veil of accountability and responsibility, but it's when people are really tested that they're found wanting. At battle fatigued, you tend to see a culture that's predominantly made up of people who want to be accountable for their decisions. However, there's been an erosion over time. That erosion is often led by external factors influencing the organization to probably step outside their values and their frames of reference and their mission and vision, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And then we see organizations who create a culture of accountability. So they actually see that accountability as one of the critical levers to move forward, and they drive that for good or for bad. And they're the organizations who tend to come out of these stressful or challenging scenarios, not only with a better safety outcome, but with a competitive advantage in the market as well. We often see these that the continuum of blame operate across the safety maturity model. So safety maturity model, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and even those who are, works from the left-hand side at counterproductive. So this counterproductive culture tends to be typified by seeing safety as a barrier to getting the job done, and safety has been, I guess, something that's potentially enforced by leadership, but no one has a lot of buy-in to, through a public compliance, where leaders often take on nearly a police person role within an organization, enforcing people to do safety. There'll often be a different culture when people are being observed versus not observed, or you'll often see leaders in that space bend the rules when they're under pressure themselves. At private compliance, we tend to see more personal, individual ownership of safety, but less likelihood to influence others. And it's when you start to get into mateship and citizenship that you see organizations really flourish in terms of ownership and accountability. So you see people looking out for themselves and their mates, and really starting to understand that what they do has a bearing on the overall organizational outcomes. To give a little bit more context to this, a blame culture tends to sit on the left-hand side of this model. So counterproductive through to private compliance. It's typified by blame, avoidance, irresponsibility, complaining, and a real problem-focused mindset. From a psychology perspective, and that's what a lot of our tools and principles are anchored on, we often see these cultures as being based in an external locus of control attitude. So when we talk about a locus of control, we talk about where we believe the power and control in our life sits. So we all have what we call internal or external locus of control frames sitting within our subconscious brains. When we're operating from an internal locus of control, we understand that we control what we think, feel, say, and do. Ultimately, we control our reactions, our responses, and what we choose to do in relation to the environmental events that we may be exposed to. When we slip into an external locus of control, which we all have the potential and ability to do, we tend to take less ownership for our decisions, and we tend to view the outcomes that we get in our life as being determined by others or the environment in which we exist. So in organizations where there's a strong external locus of control that's dominant, we tend to find a place where people are looking for someone else to blame, and people not taking that intrinsic or that internal motivation to make choices that are right for them, right for their colleagues, and right for the organization. So really what we're looking at doing is shifting to that predominant internal locus of control mindset. Because the challenge is, if you've got a culture that is dominated by blame and avoidance and irresponsibility, everyone that you put in that culture will either tend to join that culture, or if they're not comfortable within that culture, they'll leave. So that culture manifests itself, and unless there's deliberate action put into place, that's where organizations tend to get stuck. So what are the impacts of a blame culture? Well, the impacts we typically see are low personal accountability. So people just throw their hands in the air, and that often feeds into low discretionary effort. So if people needed to think outside the box to get a job done, they need to think ahead of time to make sure they had the right tools for the job. They need to report particular bits of information to enable the organization or the job to get done better. That's less likely to happen when people are operating predominantly from this blame culture. Again, we mentioned poor cultural maturity. Poor safety performance is often an output. We see a higher rate of underreporting. We see compliance only when being monitored, poor organizational climate, and a fear-based culture. More specifically, we dug into the data. So recently we did a study, and you can find this study on our website. It's called Driving a Positive Safety Culture, where we looked at over 20,000 people who were surveyed across a range of industries. We looked at the data and we identified what is the difference in cultures that are predominantly focused on blame versus ownership. So these blame cultures, or these less mature cultures, tended to be typified by these types of areas of opportunity or areas of challenge. So we found that in the cultures that were more dominated by blame and in that counterproductive to public compliance space, there was a general perception that procedures lacked value or weren't important to get the job done. There's a sense that they were too difficult, or in some instances that they were simply put in place as a ticket, like as a exercise of covering risk by the organization, and that the person wasn't really considered. As a result, many of the procedures tended to become a tick and flick exercise. So we do that as a necessary evil to make sure that we get management off our backs. So people weren't taking that ownership of making sure those were implemented effectively. This was reinforced often by a perception and a belief that in these cultures, there was very little management safety commitment. So what this means is there was a perception that there was inconsistent commitment from management, poor prioritization of safety, and a lack of safety leadership skills. So we typically saw leaders being perceived as not actively caring and not walking the talk. So as we mentioned earlier, these cultures were typified by managers saying one thing when times are good, but perhaps behaving and doing something differently when there's a time of challenge like the one that we're experiencing right now. The next key element that we tended to see come out was internal context. And this refers to the factors internal to an organization that impact on safety performance. These factors include areas such as change management, job security, general morale, and the general perception was in these blame cultures that the decisions that were made were quite knee-jerk by leaders and reactive to the situations that were found. So that were being faced. So as opposed to sitting down and thinking proactively and strategically about what leaders can control and getting people on board with that and focused on the same objectives, it would be more typified by a series of reactive decisions followed by poor communication, which drove an overall cynicism within the organization. Again, the blame culture was also typified by willingness to report incidents. Typically, the reasons people didn't want to report incidents in these types of cultures was because fear of punishment and that there was no feedback loop. So people felt that either if they reported, they'd be punished, or if they did report, nothing would be done anyway. So what's the point in reporting? And then finally, employee safety performance was another key factor here. So this relates to the fairness in relation to safety management. So in these cultures, there was a perception that safety was only made a priority when something went wrong, and safety was used as a big stick or a way of punishing people within the organizations. Typically, there's a focus on lag indicators without very much focus on lead indicators, and the good or positive safety behaviors were typically ignored. So workers were left with a sense that, hey, I can do the job 99% of the time well and not hear anything, but as soon as something goes wrong, look out. And of course, that feeds back into some of those other challenges up above, where you can see how a blame culture can play out with willingness to report incidents and internal context. On the flip side, the more mature organizations are ones that had done better at fostering a sense of ownership and accountability, were typified by doing the following things really well. And we're going to unpack these and explore these in just a moment. Firstly, they were typified by having a very clear mission and vision. So it was clearly stated, and then as you can see in the second item, it was supported by management. So management knew the mission, they knew the vision, they knew how to articulate it, and they walked the talk on a daily basis. They linked back to that safety mission and vision in their regular safety communications, in the decision making, and there was a sense of alignment. That then flowed into the within team communication. So fostering that communication to improve, collaborate, and make the place better. That then fed into a sense of safety responsibility. So people felt in these cultures where there was a clear alignment around what was expected of them and what was important to the organization, people took greater responsibility of their safety, largely because they knew what was expected of them. And then finally, in these cultures, we saw much stronger team support for safety. Again, because of that sense of alignment, because of that sense of we know what's expected of us, there was a stronger sense of psychological safety within the organization. So teams felt more comfortable to raise issues within the organization without fear of retribution. So two very different sets of outcomes, and you can see some very different focus and very different levers being pulled within each of those orgs. So let's start by talking about how leaders contribute, because what we'd suggest is that leaders play a significant role in whether a culture is a blame-based culture or an ownership-focused culture. So we're going to start by prefacing this by saying we don't believe that leaders go out to actively create a culture of blame. So often the behaviors that leaders are engaging in, which are creating the culture of the blame, are very subconscious behaviors, learned behaviors, and they're not completely conscious and aware of how their decisions are having an impact on the organizational commitment. So where do we go wrong? We go wrong because we often fundamentally approach leadership and approach safety culture from an unhelpful attitude or an unhelpful frame. So we talk about leaders at a high level having the ability to operate from one of these three leadership frames. And I'll unpack these a little bit for you. So we first of all talk about a parent frame. So a parent frame talks about a frame that's focused on I'm right, you're wrong. I'm in control, I know more than you, I'm smarter, my decisions and my opinions matter more than yours. And there's different shades and different variations of this frame, but essentially what it's saying is that I'm okay and you're not okay. I can be trusted, you can't be trusted. So it's that imposing my will and my attitude and my beliefs and my knowledge on others with the fundamental belief that I know more. And this generally drives behaviors that look to punish people because it assumes that that person was incompetent or, or has consciously or knowingly done the wrong thing. And it looks to blame people. So there's very little giving of the benefit of the doubt typically within this frame. This is a default frame for many leaders, and it can play out in the forms of feeling like you need to make all the decisions or fix all the problems. And it's often typified by if your people are quite dependent on you, and if you feel that your people roll most decisions up to you and you get frustrated, why can't they think for themselves? There may be a chance that you operate, particularly in times of stress and duress, from a parental frame. Because the challenge is, one of the other signs that you're operating from a parental frame is if you get childlike behaviors from the people that you lead. So what that looks like typically is avoidance of accepting responsibility for things in case you get blamed down the track. So I don't want to make this decision. I'd rather roll it up to my leader because I know if I make the decision, I get it wrong, there's going to be a negative consequence for me later. Or we want to push blame up the line. Don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger. And you can see how different leaders will adopt different frames of this as well. So some leaders will adopt a parent frame in challenging situations, some will adopt a child frame. So a child frame for a leader may look like, hey team, here's a new safe work procedure that we all need to engage in. Don't blame me, don't shoot the messenger, I didn't make this decision, corporate made this decision. So if you've got an issue, roll it up to them. And what we tend to see is a response from that is obviously, if I'm not taking accountability for that, then neither are my people going to. So both of these frames, parent and child, tend to be frames where we're avoiding or pushing accountability and responsibility onto other people. And they really foster this blame type of culture. The goal or the objective is to operate from an adult frame. So an adult frame fundamentally operates from an I'm okay, you're okay. I'm competent, you're competent. I'm capable, you're capable. You have value, I have value, and we can both contribute to this outcome equally. It focuses on a win-win situation, and it is typified by creating psychological trust and looking to learn from one another and having that learning culture organization. What we typically see is it's easy to operate from an adult frame when everything's going to plan. It's easy to collaborate and share ideas and work together, but it's typically when we find ourselves in challenging scenarios, much like the ones that we face now, maybe production's down, incidents occurring, things don't seem to be going planned, that leaders will slip into one of these parent or child frames. And that's when the blame culture really starts to kick into place. So a little bit of a reflection for yourselves. What behaviors do you reward, and how do you respond when things aren't going well? So do you or do your leaders in your organization promote safety when things are going well, but when production's down or when a piece of machinery is offline, we pull out all stops to get the job done? Do we then hold up that person as a hero when they're able to bring it online quicker? And if we do engage in behaviors or like that, what message does that send throughout the organization? And again, how do we behave when things are going well? Do we tend to step into that parent mode where we need to make every decision and drive the outcomes? Or do we slip into a child mode where we avoid making decisions and taking responsibility, and we try and roll it up to someone else to do that? Organizational communication becomes critical over these periods as well. So what messages are you sending to your people, and what do they consistently hear from the organization? And are they in line with the behaviors they see from their leaders on a day-to-day basis? I guess in this space, in a blame culture, we tend to see that messaging change rapidly and without consistency. So again, leaders change their messaging, change their story based on the environment that's around them, which is okay if you're anchoring that message in some key principles and values. However, often in these cultures, we see that knee-jerk response. Well, the game has changed, the plan has changed, all of that's out the window. We're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. And then again, when things don't go to plan, because people aren't clear about what's expected of them, we tend to see that blame culture kick into gear. And then, of course, thinking about how those messages contribute to that culture of blame and ownership. Finally, we tend to see there's often legacy stories in cultures of high blame that have been hanging around unaddressed for some times. So that may have been a culture where someone was disciplined for a particular safety outcome or of a safety decision, and that has just permeated throughout an organization. I think I've shared in a previous webinar, we've seen experiences on a number of occasions where people have been sacked for breaching a golden rule, and they may very well have been appropriate decisions by management. However, because of the communication that was wrapped around that, because of the story that was put around it, because of the way that was handled, those stories can often compound on one another, and 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, they become folklore, which again drive a wedge of distrust between management and the workforce. So let's imagine we're operating within a culture that is displaying some of the unhelpful behaviors and symptoms that we've shared before. So we've got a culture that's dominated by blame. How do we start to turn the ship around? What are some of the tangible, practical steps that we can think about to start to create greater ownership and accountability? A great place to start, and a place we often recommend for organizations to start, is share a strong safety vision. So organizations will often have a safety vision, but if they do have one, sometimes the why isn't clearly articulated, or it hasn't actually been shared effectively within an organization. So we'd really encourage the executive and the key leaders within the business to create a clear safety vision with it attached to a why and what's in it for me, for the individual, as opposed to a LTI target or an organizational objective. How do we make this a why that people can connect to? How do we share the vision and then reinforce it through all of our communications? So that vision becomes the target that organizations and people within the organization can aim towards together to get to improve that overall accountability. We encourage you to think about incorporating into that vision ownership outputs, or particular ownership behaviors that we want to see more of. So Paul O'Neill, ex-CEO of Alcoa, who sadly recently passed away, has a fantastic story to tell about how he used safety as a lever to really not only make Alcoa during his time in charge a safer place, but also a much more profitable organization. And he used safety as an opportunity to talk to his people all the time. He wanted people to feel included and safe, not only psychologically, but physically, and he wanted people to feel like they had the tools and the resources to do a job. And he tells a story in one of his videos that you can find on YouTube, that he was on a site where there was an incident where a young man jumped a barricade and was crushed by a piece of machinery. He was shocked at the time that his leadership team responded by saying, what was he thinking? There was a barricade there. How could he have been so silly? And there was a lot of blame attributed to the individual. What Paul did, because he wanted to really focus his executive team and his leadership team as a whole on not what they can't control, that is other people's decisions, but what they can control, i.e. the culture that they've created, he said, no, we played a significant role in killing him. We killed him through being ineffective in our recruitment, or we killed him through having inappropriate levels of supervision, or through our training program, or not having the appropriate mentoring program. So his challenge in that scenario wasn't to leadership team, wasn't to try and shift blame and accountability away from that leadership team, but in fact, just the opposite. Instead of looking at it as something that was completely external to them and they had no influence over, he really challenged them to look at, well, what was our role, or in Centre's language, what was our 50% in contributing to this outcome? And what could we do to ensure this never happens again? So when executing on the vision, it's important to ensure that we're aligned both from a leadership perspective. We've got clear communications around that, and we're clear about the behaviors that we expect from people in relation to that vision. And this is where we're going to talk about values in just a moment. We want to monitor organizational communications to ensure that they focus on creating personal ownership. We want to create some accountability within the organization. So we want to actually reward and recognize leaders who really role model the behaviors well and hold the ones who aren't to account. So I spoke about before having clear organizational behaviors. Organizations who we've seen really bring a vision and mission to life effectively tend to be strong values-based organizations. And values are really powerful because what they have the ability to do is clearly define the expectations of people within the organization. So you can use values and extrapolate on them to say, this is the value we operate from, or the attitude, or the frame of reference, whatever we want to call it. And these are the behaviors that are linked to that particular value. And if we get that right, it gives us an opportunity for leaders to have values-based conversations with their people, hire and fire based on those conversations, and it enables us to have easier and more consistent messaging. It also gives a framework for us to make challenging decisions as well. So if we don't have a strong set of frames that we reference to, when we have to make challenging safety or business decisions, what do we anchor those decisions back to? It often comes down to whoever the strongest voice in the room is. So those values become that guiding guiding principle to help us hit that vision. There's been some really famous organisations that have used a values-based approach. One is the All Blacks. So again, they get a lot of attention, and if anyone's interested, the book Legacy is a cracking one to read more about how the All Blacks used a values-based approach to really transform into the winning, I guess, organisation or sporting team that we see today. So they went through with a bunch of senior players and they defined a set of values that they believed were in line with the values of the New Zealand people, and that would also help them be incredibly successful as well. And there's some really awesome ones here. So there's a sweep the sheds. So this is about humility. So you think about a team full of stars like the All Blacks. The number one value they've got is they sweep the sheds. And what that means is we're going to be humble at every time, and someone stays behind after every game and makes sure that they leave the dressing sheds clean and neat for whoever has to come back and clean up for them. What an amazing value to have to bring humility to that team. You've got other ones like number 6 there, which talks to even if you're the best player, it doesn't matter if you don't align to these values. So they'll, again, hire and fire based on whether someone is in line with their values. Ritualize to actualize talks to training the way you want to play. Be a good ancestor talks about leaving a positive legacy. So some really awesome values and principles listed out there for new team members to be inducted into. And of course, they use the senior members of their team to really drive and hold people to account based on these values. We at Centus are also a values-based organisation. I'm just quickly sharing our values, one, because we're very proud of them, but two, because we went through a process which enabled us to view our values as a competitive advantage and a way of aligning expectations in the organisation. So for anyone who's interested in spending a bit more time thinking and learning about their values, I'd encourage you to download or buy the book, The Advantage by Patrick Lencioni. And what Patrick Lencioni writes about in that book is that you need to think about values in a way that differentiates you within the market, that differentiates you as an organization. He challenges organizations to think beyond the typical values of accountability, responsibility, like the general ones that we see repeated over and over and over again. Because he says, look, there's some values that you need to have that are just permission to play in business. So how are you going to use values to differentiate you and make you really a different type of organization that people can really connect to. So we use that process and we were able to align our values and have some really strong behaviors that came out of the back of that. So for example, own it. We're responsible for making things happen. We choose our attitude, we accept our fears and face the hurdles. We test ourselves to find new solutions. We start important conversations, use our strengths and always back ourselves. So these become an anchoring point in a lot of conversations, in our success profile conversations, and in most decisions we make within an organization. And it takes some of the guesswork out of, is this the right thing or the wrong thing to do for the business? Another fundamental part of creating an organization where there's ownership is creating a culture where people feel like they're included, they contribute. And that typically is defined in what we'd call building a learning culture. So in a learning culture, we're actively promoting focusing on learning from errors and incidents and avoiding placing blame. We're really challenging leaders and team members to take a learning mindset and learn from one another and share those learnings more broadly across the organization. So the response is, as opposed to who can we blame, it's what can we learn? Of course, in order to have a learning culture, people need to feel a sense of psychological safety and trust. They need to feel a sense that if they do talk up, there won't be retribution that will follow. So we'll cover off very quickly now a couple of principles that we see in building effective trust and psychological safety. So the principles we'll talk through quickly will be active care, seeking to understand, giving permission to play, developing helpful frames, and early, often, and ugly. Showing we care talks to putting context of what you know about your people. So this is about really taking the time to understand what motivates and drives your people, what the barriers to getting the job done are, and letting them know that they can they can trust you and that you care about them on more than I guess a organizational level. So this is about leaders getting to know their people and giving them the benefit of the doubt. So you can see the quote here, this seems out of character for you. Can we talk about what's going on here? So if a team member doesn't set an expectation, it's coming from a place of, well, I know you, I trust you. How can we work through this together to get a better outcome next time? Again, this is closely tied to taking on this seeking to understand mindset. So, and the question which is typified in this approach is, can you help me understand how we ended up here? So this taps really strongly into a learning mindset and blends humility and curiosity. I see this play out really nicely for organizations when leaders go into the field and engage with their workforce. If they take on the mindset that I want to understand what the experience of working for this organization is like for my team members, I want to understand what I'm doing well and what I can be doing better and how we can generally improve things, we tend to see a very different type of conversation to maybe a conversation where we feel like the purpose is to catch people doing the wrong thing and correct their behaviors. So starting from a more neutral position and having a curiosity mindset becomes a really useful way to start to build relationships, build trust, and build psychological safety. Giving permission to play talks to creating some structure that enables discussions around important decisions in the business. So this is a fair bit of consultation and collaboration. So this might come into, say, planning for a new job. It might start at a pre-start shift. It might start with a procuring of a piece of equipment or looking at rolling out a new policy or procedure. So it talks to finding and engaging with people within the business who might actually know more than us and creating a space where they can feel free to provide us with feedback with the goal of making sure that whatever we do is as effective as it possibly can be. So again, we see this play out all the time with organizations that we work with. It'll be comments like, oh, corporate made this decision to buy this piece of kit, but they've got no idea how to buy the job. Now we're stuck with something which is suboptimal, which actually puts us at greater risk than if we just spent the money and got the right piece of gear. We're now gonna have to go spend all this money to retrofit it to actually make it work. So in those sorts of circumstances, not only does that erode trust and psychological safety, it creates a blame culture where you've got sort of the workforce blaming executives get frustrated, they blame the workforce, and you create that us and them culture, which consultation and creating spaces for people to engage in the conversation can address that up front. It feels like it takes longer, but it will generally save a bunch of time and effort later down the track. Being very clear about the frames that we hand our teams is another really important piece here. So developing helpful frames. So this is about recognizing when the team has done something really well and framing that in a way that says, well, this is the type of team that we are. It's also about being very careful that when we're faced with a challenging situation, we're not framing it, framing the challenge from who can we blame? Can we blame another department or another person or another individual or a contractor? It's coming from a place of proactive internal locus of control. What can we learn from this? What are the potential implications of this? How can we move through this together? So the example here is I'm really proud of the way this team has responded to a challenging situation. It would have been easier for us to blame others, but we've accepted our portion of responsibility and moved forward. So really reinforcing and sharing the types of frames that we want people to adopt. Being mindful that as a leader in a position of influence, the frame that we share is going to be the frame that people are more likely to adopt. And finally, early, often, and ugly. So this talks to encouraging really proactive ownership of mistakes or potential hazards that have been identified within the organization. So this is about actively promoting and rewarding lead indicators. So if someone's made a mistake and they're willing to own up to it, or if there's been a near miss or a particular challenge playing out, actually celebrating that success. And organizations who build strong psychological safety and are really innovative and move quickly, such as Google and a range of different organizations, are really effective at reinforcing that we want to know about mistakes and issues earlier on so they don't become bigger down the line. Again, really interesting studies on organizations that do this really well in Amy Edmondson's The Fearless Organization, if anyone is interested in learning more about psychological safety and trust. Reward and recognition tends to be another key lever. So once we've got the values up and running, once we know what our vision, our mission is, it's about focusing on conscious acknowledgement of positive behaviors, not just achievement of KPIs. So it's about focusing on the behaviors and values being played out and recognizing that in an effective way. So effective recognition tends to be the closer to the event happening, the more effective the recognition. And if we can get the recognition coming from 360, so from peers and from leaders and from people who are being led, that means that you're much more likely to have values and behaviors reinforced from all directions. Again, just sharing an idea that we've borrowed from some of our really strong positive safety culture clients. They tend to find that peer recognition and peer support programs work really well, and certainly we've found that to be incredibly effective at centres. So we have our BOSS Awards. So BOSS stands for Bring Our Passion, Own It, Seek Mastery, and Show We Care. And this is an opportunity for anyone in the organisation to recognise anyone else in their role modeling of the behaviours. And it's purely based on, I've seen this person role modeling this behaviour really well, and I want to write a note to recognise it. And this comes in the form of writing a card that goes to the individual, a small gift voucher of $30 or $50 to recognise that behaviour within the individual. Not enough to mean that someone's going to fudge the numbers or do the wrong things, but enough to help people feel that they've been acknowledged and appreciated. And so that the individuals get that immediate recognition from their peer or from their leader or vice versa. And we then share that at our monthly team meetings. We say, look, these are the people that we've seen really role modeling the behaviors well. So you're really holding up in lights the people and the behaviors that you want to see more of. Finally, when it comes to safety, if we can build in a sense of personal responsibility to what's in it for them, and this comes back to that vision and mission at the start, that why, you've got much more chance of people owning the outcome. So we talk about at Centres the concept of the personal big five. So this talks to the 5 most important things, people, places, and situations to you. So things like typically your family or your health or your relationships or what you do for fun. And what we suggest is that organizations that are effective at embedding this concept clearly send a message to people in their organization that safety is an investment as opposed to a cost. So it's an investment when I'm making safe choices in the things that matter most to me. Organizations who don't do this so well tend to focus on external focus to the factors to the person, things like lag indicators like total recordable injury frequency rates, or the impact on the organization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And as a result, in those organizations, we see a reluctance to engage with safety because it's seen as a cost. It costs too much time, it costs too much effort, it costs too much energy, it gets in the way of getting the job done. So again, this all ties back into, where possible, tying it back to the individual, tying it back to the what's in it for me, being very clear about expectations and rewarding the positive behaviors that we want to see more of. And finally, in regards to challenging people to think differently, to reduce blame, we want to encourage, whenever we can, whenever something doesn't go to plan, what's our 50%? So we talk about what's our 50%? What was my portion of responsibility or accountability in this particular outcome? And to be clear, 50% isn't always a clean down the line statistic. Sometimes we have 10% a portion of responsibility and accountability. Sometimes we might have 99%. But the intent of that question is to get us thinking about what role did I play in this outcome and what can I do differently to get a different outcome next time. Next one to reduce blame is to encourage people to walk the talk and to walk in the person's shoes. So what we typically find in blame cultures is there's an assumption that, let's say there's an incident that's occurred, we do an incident investigation, that incident investigation inevitably goes back to that person made a silly choice. What we typically find is it's not just one factor which contributed to that person making that choice. There'll often be leadership pressures or organizational pressures or procedural issues or not having the right kit for the job, which have all compounded and together made it very challenging for that person to make the decision that we would have preferred them to have made. So to reduce blame, what we encourage people to really reflect on is, if I was in that person's shoes, would I have done how would I have felt? What would that experience have been like? And what can we learn, which means that we won't put someone else in a similar position. On the flip side, to encourage accountability, focus again on what we can control, and then focus on what has worked in the past. So again, this is a real strengths-based approach. So what can we learn from what went well before that we can replicate in this particular situation? Because inevitably, what you're doing by doing that is you're focusing on what we can control as opposed to what we can't control, and people gain confidence from having succeeded previously in a particular situation. Finally, what does a strong safety culture or a culture of accountability look like? I guess my response to this is it's going to look slightly different for many organizations depending on specifically the objectives that you want to achieve. We obviously spoke about the All Blacks and their culture. Southwest Airline often gets held up as a really strong culture in terms of ownership and accountability. So they're focused on actively caring for their employees. Then in turn, the employees have cared for their customers. Zappos was really popular for a while because of a strong anchoring in values. There's a number of these organization examples, Google, etc. Although they're very different organizations and they've probably got slightly different spins to what they put out there, and they don't always get it right. No one always gets it right. If you go through and you look at what all of those organizations have done effectively, it often comes back to the principles we've spoken about today. Clear mission, clear vision, values, strong inclusiveness, psychological safety, and opportunities for people to express themselves and be creative. So if we can get those fundamentals right, get that clear alignment, and if we can get leaders buying into it and being consistent in their communication throughout the organization, the trick is messaging in a way that helps the team and the organization buy into what you're selling. So we're going to go over to you for some questions now. So if you'd like to type any questions that you have in the chat, Gemma will curate those and send those through. Just in the meantime, while we're waiting for those questions to come through, a couple of quick offers to throw out there. We've offered this in the last couple of webinars. We're about to close the next cohort for our intensive leadership program. We've only got a couple of spaces left. For those of you who aren't aware of this, the intensive leadership program is made up of six 90-minute webinars plus supporting resources. And what it does is it gets you some time with one of our facilitators, Claire, who's been in industry and been an organizational psychologist for many, many years. And she walks you through a journey of defining the culture you want to see, creating a culture of trust, looking at leadership frames and leadership reference points to create psychological safety, effective ways of challenging people to take ownership, reward and recognition through hunting the good stuff, and building a plan for cultural change. So she collates these in a series of sessions and provides you with a really rich resource pool to take back and be a strong influencer and leader within your organization. Feedback that we've had so far has been awesome in relation to the content, but interestingly, the other value proposition out of this is the opportunity to work with peers from across a range of organizations. So the feedback has been, send us, you've been great in facilitating and providing really rich content, and it's been awesome to be able to catch up with my peers from other organizations and talk through challenges and what they've done to address it. So if you're interested in participating in that and interested in making some connections and making some networks, I'll ask James to whack a poll up on the screen now, and that will give you an opportunity to nominate your interest. So if you do nominate your interest, we'll just click yes, and one of the team will get in contact with you. Great. Gemma, any questions coming through so far?
Yeah, there sure is. Our first one is from Jason. So whilst I live these values regularly and have seen what good looks like, the current organisation I'm in is very low on the maturity scale. I chip away regularly on safety, but what's one point you might suggest is a good way to make an impact in safety amongst business leadership?
Great. Well, Jason, great question. Often the challenge that we face in creating organizational change is alignment, not around what the solution is, but in fact around what the problem is. So until you get alignment from your most senior leaders in the business about what your barriers to success are going to look like in regards to safety or organizational performance, it's really difficult to offer up suggestions and solutions, because you'll have such a strong divergence in opinions at that executive level that people will crowd each other out and smother each other. So my encouragement to you, Jason, would be looking at ways that you can clearly define the job to be done or the problem to be solved. And again, that might come through getting feedback from your workforce, engaging with your executive. Sometimes it's done through things like climate surveys or diagnostic tools. It might also be around looking at having a guest speaker come in and meet with your executive and talk to them about what effective versus ineffective looks like. And sometimes industry experts or people who've walked in their shoes can be really effective at doing that. So I guess my challenge is, Jason, instead of focusing on the solution, I'd be focusing on the problem and working hard to get a clear definition of that. Because once you get a clear definition of the job to be done or the problem to be solved, things get a little bit easier from there. Thanks, Gemma. Actually, just while we're getting some more questions in, there's one more offer we wanted to throw out there as well, and that is for the Zip Essentials program. So we've taken Zip, our flagship offering, online, and what Zip focuses on is creating personal ownership and accountability within your organization. So what we've been able to develop through this tool is a way of creating a cultural change within your organization where people take greater ownership and accountability of their safety choices without the operational impact of having to take people off the tools. So you're reducing the time off the tools in this particular process by about 80%, and we're able to achieve some amazing results and some great sustainability there. So if you're interested in seeing what that's like, I'll ask James to chuck up another poll there, and we can contact you in relation to that particular tool as well for a free trial. So Gemma, any other questions that have come through?
Yeah, some really great questions. And the next one's from Matthew. And he's asked, what strategies can you recommend for cutting through the mates boys club type behaviour that circumvents the formal reporting processes?
Right. So it sounds like you've got a bit of a club happening within your organisation where whatever suggestion is offered up by leaders is eroded through that boys club camaraderie that can sort of take place. That is typified by a culture that focuses on I guess people's skills at the exclusion of values and behaviors. So I typically see this play out where you've got operators who've been in the business for 20, 30 years. And I saw it in an organization not too recently where an older chap bullied my key contact within an organization who was a younger lady openly in front of his mates. He belittled her and made fun of her. I challenged him and he went quiet. And when I escalated that within the organization, the response was, oh, you know what, that's just that person, they've been here for 40, 50 years, they don't know any better. This is where values become incredibly important, and leaders need to understand that the values are the guiding essence of an organization. So you get what you tolerate in that instance. So what I'd be challenging, I guess, Matthew, your organization to look at is, what are the values of your organization? What are the behaviors linked to that? And how does that match or mismatch with the boys club mentality that you've got happening within the business? And then you need some brave leaders to step up and take ownership and responsibility. And often when you're faced with those types of cultures, you'll have leaders slip into that child type of reference point. So it's a complex question, Matthew, but it's a values conversation. If that's the way they're behaving, if that's the implication it's having on people around them, if it's that boys club mentality, again, that often comes with that bullying and that really uncomfortable environment, it becomes a simple values conversation and bravery to say, look, if you're not going to operate within our frames of reference or within our values, you might be the best operator that we've got, but just like the All Blacks have said in that point number 6, we hire and fire based on values. So of course you've got to give people clear expectations and give them a chance to change, but we'd be really challenging your leaders to take a values-based approach to that, even if they are your best operators. Thanks, Gemma. Any other ones come through?
Yeah, our next one is from Lee, and he has asked, how do you change authoritarian leaders to take on the 50% ownership concept?
Yes. Good question, Lee, and it takes time is the question. First of all, I'm going to start by saying most leaders who engage in those authoritarian or parental leadership styles often aren't completely aware of how they're being perceived by those around them, and don't understand the negative implications or impacts of what they're being done. So from a psychology perspective, we often say that the first step in change is understanding that you need to change and why you need to change. So the first step in that instance is about helping those leaders understand the implications or the impacts that they're having on those around them. And there's a range of ways that you can do that. 360 assessment tools can be really helpful in doing that. We've had that be effective within some leaders. Again, getting organizational feedback that is delivered back to the executive team becomes useful. So providing that feedback becomes crucial. The challenge that we do face, though, Lee, is you kind of need your most senior leader or leaders to be clear about what they expect from their leaders. And unfortunately, if your most senior leader in the organization is authoritarian, that's a very difficult, you really got to try and change them, and by nature that's difficult. So you need to find someone in that senior space often to leverage practically to be able to cascade that through the organization. If you've got an executive there and you've got someone that's on board and role models the types of leadership that you want to see, sometimes working towards your strengths and looking at how you can push that movement out becomes really useful. But it certainly is tricky if you don't have high-level support, Lee. But yeah, awareness is the first key we would suggest. And then from there, there's a range of different tools, from coaching to training programs that are out there. And certainly that's our bread and butter that help leaders transition through that process. Thanks, Gemma. Any other ones?
One final question from Jerome, and that is, when I visit, it's not always apparent straight away that a blame culture exists. When talking with workers privately, what questions could I ask to lead a discussion to find out this information?
Great, thanks for the question, Jerome. Another good one. So in this instance, this is that curiosity mindset that we spoke about earlier. So seeking to understand. So as opposed to saying, do you feel like there's a blame culture here? What we'd encourage you to do is to ask the team member about their experience. What do they enjoy about their job? What do they not enjoy about their job? What are the challenges to getting their job done well? How comfortable do they feel to raise issues and challenges? You know, do they feel like they've got a voice? Do they feel like they can be heard? Do they feel like they're confident to speak up? If not, why not? If so, why? So looking for some of the symptoms and hints and tips that we've spoken about today. You know, as the conversation goes on, as people become more comfortable with you, they will generally reveal more and more and more about what their experience at work is like. And if you're taking a genuine interest in what they're doing and how they're doing it and why they're doing it, they'll get that sense. So what, again, we'd encourage you to do is go in with that learning mindset, go in with curiosity, and be generally and show that you care about your team, be genuinely interested and engaged about their role. And as you build that trust and that connection with that person, you can see those little threads popping out, and then you can sort of pull on those threads and dig a bit deeper and understand a little bit more specifically the challenges that they face. So that's what we've seen work really well. Great. So thanks, Gemma. No other questions?
No further questions.
Great. Well, everyone, thank you for hanging on the line. We really appreciate your commitment to creating a culture of ownership and accountability and addressing the blame culture. We've all worked in these cultures before, and not only are they less safe than cultures of ownership and responsibility, they're just not that great. They're not very enjoyable to work in. So by participating in this webinar, I can see that you're really committed to making your workplaces safer and just generally better places to be. So thank you for that commitment. Take care and look forward to catching you on one of our upcoming webinars. Thank you.